Hey there. Picture this. It's 20,000 years ago. The entire northern half of the planet is buried under a wall of ice 2 miles thick. Temperatures are regularly hitting -40, and somehow, a bunch of furless, fangless, basically naked primates decided this was a great place to live. Bold choice, honestly. Today we're talking about the Ice Age. And no, not the movie with the goofy squirrel, though respect to that squirrel. We're talking about the real thing. The most extreme, most brutal, and somehow most alive era in Earth's recent history. A world where mammoths the size of double-decker buses roamed from Spain to Alaska, where glaciers carved entire mountain ranges like butter, and where the ancestors of every human alive today figured out how to not just survive, but thrive in a frozen apocalypse. This is the story of how ice shaped our planet, our species, and honestly, our future too. It's wilder than any sci-fi script and more dramatic than any disaster movie Hollywood has ever greenlit. So smash that like button if you're ready to go back to the deep freeze, and drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? I genuinely want to know. Let's go. Let's start at the very beginning. Not the beginning of life, not the beginning of humans, but the beginning of cold. Real, bone-crushing, civilization-threatening cold. Because here's something most people never think about. Earth was not always the planet we know today. For most of its 4.5 billion year history, our world was significantly warmer. There were rainforests near the poles. Crocodiles sunbathing in what is now the Canadian Arctic. Basically, for a huge stretch of geological time, Earth was running a permanent tropical vacation mode. And then something changed. Or rather, a lot of things changed all at once in the slowest, most catastrophic slow motion you can possibly imagine. To understand the Ice Age, you have to understand that Earth doesn't just sit still and mind its own business. The planet is constantly in motion, not just spinning and orbiting, but shifting and tilting and wobbling in ways that completely transform the climate over millions of years. The continents drift, the ocean floors spread. Mountain ranges rise up out of nothing, which sounds dramatic because it absolutely is. And each of these geological events has consequences that ripple forward through time, like dominoes falling in geological slow motion. One of the biggest triggers for the cooling of our planet was something called the closing of the Tethys Sea. Hundreds of millions of years ago, there was a massive warm ocean sitting right where the Middle East and Central Asia are today. That ocean helped distribute heat around the planet like a giant slow-moving conveyor belt. But as the continents shifted and collided, Africa grinding into Europe, India slamming into Asia with enough force to build the Himalayas, that warm ocean gradually disappeared. And without it, the planet lost one of its most important heating systems. Then the Himalayas themselves became part of the problem, or the solution, depending on your perspective. Those enormous mountains, the tallest on Earth, still growing by a few millimeters every year, which is genuinely unsettling when you think about it, began chemically reacting with the atmosphere on a massive scale. Rain falling on fresh rock triggers a process called silicate weathering, which pulls carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and locks it into minerals. Carbon dioxide, as we now very much know, is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat. So as the Himalayas grew and weathering accelerated, CO2 levels in the atmosphere began to drop, slowly, over millions of years, but drop they did. Less CO2 meant less heat trapped. Less heat trapped meant lower average temperatures. Lower average temperatures meant that snow falling in the high latitudes in winter wasn't fully melting in summer anymore. And here's where things get genuinely clever in the worst possible way. Snow and ice are white. White surfaces reflect sunlight back into space instead of absorbing it. So the more ice you have, the more sunlight gets reflected, the cooler the planet gets, which creates more ice, which reflects more sunlight, which cools things further. Scientists call this the ice albedo feedback loop. The rest of us can call it a one-way ticket to an ice age with no return policy. But the continents and the chemistry weren't the only forces at work. Earth's orbit is not perfectly circular. It's not perfectly stable. Over tens of thousands of years, the shape of our orbit around the Sun changes from more circular to more elliptical and back again, a cycle that takes about 100,000 years. At the same time, Earth's axial tilt wobbles between about 22 and 24.5 degrees on a 41,000-year cycle, and Earth also wobbles on its axis like a slightly off-balance spinning top, completing one full wobble roughly every 26,000 years, Together, these three cycles, named Milankovitch cycles after the Serbian astronomer Milutin Milankovic, who figured this out in the early 20th century, essentially doing the math by hand, which earns him a permanent place in the pantheon of people. With extraordinary patience, control how much solar energy different parts of the planet receive and when. When these cycles align in a way that reduces summer sunlight hitting the northern hemisphere, ice sheets start to grow, and once they start growing, that feedback loop kicks in, and the planet slides deeper and deeper into glaciation. The key isn't total solar energy, it's distribution. Specifically, cooler summers in the northern hemisphere mean last winter's snow survives long enough to become next year's ice, and the year after that, and the decade after that, until eventually you've got ice sheets kilometers thick sitting on top of what used to be forests. This process doesn't happen overnight, and when we say that, we mean it quite literally. We're talking thousands of years, tens of thousands. Ice ages build slowly and end somewhat faster, but even the fast parts operate on timescales that make human history look like a brief footnote. The most recent glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age when the ice sheets were at their biggest, occurred roughly 20,000 years ago. At that point, ice covered about a third of Earth's land surface. The ice sheet sitting on top of what is now North America was in places more than 3 kilometers thick. That's not a typo, 3 kilometers. The Laurentide ice sheet, as geologists call it, was so heavy that it actually pushed the continent down by hundreds of meters, and the land is still bouncing back today, rising a few millimeters per year in places like Scandinavia and Canada in a process called post-glacial rebound. The ice age ended thousands of years ago, and the ground is still recovering. That's how serious this was. Now, here's an important thing to clarify, and this is where a lot of people get confused. When we talk about the Ice Age, we're usually referring to a specific period that began about 2.6 million years ago, and technically, by geological definitions, hasn't ended. We're currently living in an Ice Age. We're just in a warmer phase of it called an interglacial, specifically the Holocene interglacial, which began about 11,700 years ago. During an ice age in the geological sense, Earth regularly cycles between glacial periods, when the ice sheets advance, and interglacials, when they retreat. We happen to be in one of the warm, comfortable chapters. The Ice Age chapters were considerably less comfortable, as we're about to discuss in extraordinary detail. What triggered the most recent major glaciation cycle, which is what most people mean when they say the Ice Age, was a combination of all these factors converging at roughly the same time. The planet had been cooling for millions of years due to geological and chemical processes. The orbital cycles aligned in just the right unfortunate configuration, and the climate system, already primed for instability, tipped into a new state. Like a boulder balanced at the top of a hill, it just needed the right push. Earth got that push about 2.6 million years ago, and the world as we know it today was born from the consequences. The planet that emerged from this slow-motion freeze was almost unrecognizable. Gone were the subtropical forests of the northern continents. Gone were the palm trees in Europe, the verdant plains of the Sahara, the warm, shallow seas that once spread across the American interior. In their place came something harder, stranger, and in its own brutal way, more magnificent than anything that had come before. Here's something nobody tells you in school about glaciers. They are not peaceful. The image people have, serene blue ice, quiet landscapes, the gentle creak of a slow-moving frozen river, is about as accurate as calling a demolition crew a renovation team. Glaciers are geological wrecking balls. They are among the most destructive and transformative forces this planet has ever produced, and during the last glacial maximum, they covered roughly 30 million square kilometers of land and rewrote the geography of the entire planet. Basically, glaciers did to the continents what a very powerful, very motivated, and completely indifferent interior designer does to a room. They tore everything out and started from scratch. To understand how a glacier actually works, you have to let go of the idea of ice as a solid, rigid, stationary thing. Under enormous pressure, ice behaves more like an extremely slow-moving fluid. A glacier flows under its own weight, deforming and creeping downhill, millimeters or meters per day depending on conditions. And as it flows, it does something remarkable and catastrophic in equal measure. It picks things up, not small things. Not pebbles. Glaciers pick up entire chunks of bedrock, boulders the size of houses, slabs of granite the size of city blocks, and carry them along for the ride. The technical term for this is glacial erratics, which is a wonderfully polite name for what is essentially the planet dropping enormous rocks in completely random places hundreds of kilometers from where they started. You can find boulders in the flat plains of the American Midwest that originated in Canada. Giant chunks of Scandinavian granite sitting in the middle of Germany with absolutely no local explanation. For centuries, nobody could figure out where these mystery rocks came from. It wasn't until the 19th century that geologists pieced together the answer. A glacier put them there. Which, when you think about it, is the most metal geological explanation imaginable. But the carrying of boulders is just the flashy part. The real work of glaciers is in the grinding. The base of a glacier is studded with all that debris, rocks, gravel, fragments of every size, and as the glacier slides over bedrock it uses those fragments as tools. It's essentially a conveyor belt of sandpaper, except the sandpaper is made of granite, and the surface being sanded is an entire mountain range. The result is something geologists call glacial abrasion, and over thousands of years it can shave entire mountains down to their roots, carve valleys into shapes that no river could ever achieve, and polish bedrock so smooth you can see your reflection in it. The valleys carved by glaciers are unmistakable. River valleys are V-shaped, carved by water cutting downward along a narrow path. Glacial valleys are U-shaped, carved by ice that fills the entire valley floor and grinds it flat and wide as it moves. The fjords of Norway, the lochs of Scotland, the spectacular valleys of Yosemite, all of these are glacial work. Not metaphorically, literally. The sheer vertical walls of Yosemite Valley, the breathtaking depth of Norwegian fjords dropping hundreds of meters below sea level, these are the direct result of glaciers spending thousands of years doing their slow, relentless, utterly indifferent work. And it wasn't just the landscapes that changed. The ice sheets were so massive, so incomprehensibly heavy, that they pushed the continental crust downward by hundreds of meters. In Scandinavia, the ice sheet was so thick and so heavy that it depressed the land beneath it by as much as 800 meters in some places. 800 meters! The ground under all that ice wasn't just cold, it was physically pushed into the mantle like a thumb pressing into soft clay. When the ice finally melted, the land started rising back up, and it's still doing so today at rates of up to a centimetre per year in parts of Sweden and Finland. You can actually measure it. Scientists track it with GPS. The ghost of the Ice Age is still pushing Scandinavia toward the sky. Now here's the part that changes the whole map. When you lock up a significant portion of the world's water in ice sheets kilometers thick, that water has to come from somewhere. It comes from the oceans. During the last glacial maximum, global sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. That's not a rounding error. That's a fundamental restructuring of where the ocean ends and the land begins. Drop sea levels by 120 meters, and the world map transforms beyond recognition. The British Isles aren't islands anymore. They're a western peninsula of continental Europe. You could walk from London to Paris without getting your feet wet, which sounds like a charming day trip until you remember it was also about -20 degrees, and a woolly mammoth might be having opinions about your route. The shallow seas between what is now Russia and Alaska, the Bering Strait, today only about 55 meters deep at its shallowest point, completely disappeared. In their place was a broad, grassy landmass stretching hundreds of kilometers north to south, connecting Asia and North America. Geologists call this Beringia. It was not a narrow land bridge. It was essentially a continent unto itself, a vast Arctic grassland with its own ecosystems and its own wildlife. And it was the highway that allowed humans and animals to migrate from the Old World into the Americas. This matters enormously. Without lower sea levels, there is no Beringia. Without Beringia, the Americas stay empty of humans for potentially thousands of additional years. The entire human history of two continents hinges on the fact that enough water was locked up in ice to expose a strip of land at the top of the world. The Ice Age didn't just reshape geography, it wrote the script for where humanity would eventually live, farm, build cities, and eventually argue about on the internet. The same dynamic played out across Southeast Asia, where islands that are now separated by shallow seas were once connected by exposed land. The Indonesian archipelago, today thousands of separate islands, was dramatically different during the glacial maximum. A vast landmass called Sundaland connected what is now Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula into a single enormous continent, roughly the size of Western Europe. Animals and people moved across it freely. Ancient human populations that today seem separated by ocean once shared continuous territory. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, those connections were severed, populations were isolated, and the genetic and cultural diversity we see today in Southeast Asia was partly shaped by the ice disappearing. The glaciers also fundamentally reorganized river systems. Rivers that today flow in entirely different directions were redirected, captured, or simply created by the movement of ice and the redistribution of meltwater. The Missouri River, which today flows east and south across the central United States, was essentially rerouted by glaciers. Its predecessor flowed north into Canada before being blocked by advancing ice and forced to find a new path. The Thames in England follows a completely different course than its pre-glacial ancestor, which was itself a tributary of the Rhine. These aren't obscure geological trivia. They're evidence of how completely the Ice Age rewrote the physical world from scratch. And then there were the glacial lakes. When ice sheets advance, they don't just cover land, they also block river drainages and create enormous lakes backed up behind ice dams. During the peak of the last Ice Age, and especially during the period of glacial retreat that followed, North America was home to some of the largest lakes in the history of the planet. Lake Agassiz, which formed around 12,000 years ago as the ice sheets began their final retreat, was at its maximum extent larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined. Its shorelines stretched across what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and the northern United States. It held more fresh water than all the world's lakes today, combined, and it wasn't stable. It drained, refilled, expanded, contracted, and eventually, in events we'll come back to later, catastrophically collapsed in ways that changed the global climate almost overnight. The sheer scale of this transformation is difficult to process from the comfortable vantage point of the present. We live in what is, by geological standards, an unusually stable and temperate world. The extreme makeover that the Ice Age performed on this planet, the carved valleys, the relocated boulders, the redirected rivers, the exposed continents, the depressed and rebounding crust, is everywhere around us if you know how to look. The Great Lakes are glacial basins. The flat plains of the northern Midwest are ancient lake beds and glacial outwash plains. The Cape Cod Peninsula in Massachusetts is a glacial moraine, a heap of debris piled up at the edge of an ice sheet that no longer exists. Long Island, New York, same thing. The entire landscape of the northern world is, in a very real sense, a sculpture. The glacier was the artist. It just didn't ask permission before starting. What emerged from all this destruction counterintuitively was one of the most productive and biologically extraordinary ecosystems in Earth's history. Not in the ice itself, obviously. The ice was not a great place to set up shop. But at its edges, in the vast territory between the ice sheets and the warmer latitudes to the south, something remarkable was taking shape. A world of cold grasslands, frozen tundra, and unexpected abundance, stretching across half the planet, teeming with animals that make today's wildlife look almost ordinary by comparison. That world had a name. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe. And it was like nothing that has existed before or since. So we've established that the Ice Age turned the planet's geography into a complete renovation project without anyone's consent. But here's what most people picture when they hear Ice Age, and it's almost entirely wrong. They imagine a barren, frozen wasteland, white emptiness stretching to every horizon. Maybe a lonely cave person huddled over a fire questioning their life choices. And while that's a wonderfully dramatic mental image, the reality was actually far more interesting and far more alive than the movie version suggests. Because right at the edges of those enormous ice sheets, in the territory between the glaciers and the warmer southern zones, there existed an ecosystem so vast, so productive, and so teeming with life that nothing like it has existed on Earth before, or since. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe, and if you handed a modern ecologist a time machine and asked them to go see it, they would come back speechless. The Mammoth Steppe was not a single place. It was a biome, a type of ecosystem, that stretched in an almost unbroken band around the entire northern part of the planet. From the Atlantic coast of what is now Spain and France, across Europe, across the full width of Russia and Siberia, across the Beringia land bridge we talked about earlier, and all the way into Alaska and the Yukon. At its maximum extent, this ecosystem covered somewhere between 50 and 60 million square kilometers, that is, to be extremely clear about the scale we're talking about, larger than the combined area of South America and the continental United States. It was the single largest terrestrial ecosystem in the history of this planet. The Amazon rainforest, which we rightly celebrate as one of the most biologically significant places on Earth today, would have fit inside the Mammoth Steppe several times over with room to spare. Now, what made this ecosystem so special wasn't just its size, it was what it was made of and how it worked. The Mammoth Steppe was primarily a cold grassland, similar in structure to today's steppes and prairies, but significantly more productive than modern Arctic or subarctic landscapes. The key difference was the soil. Glacial action had ground bedrock into fine mineral-rich particles, and the cold, dry climate preserved organic material in the upper soil layer without breaking it down the way warmer climates do. The result was deep, extraordinarily fertile soil sitting under a carpet of grasses, sedges, herbs, and flowering plants. The Mammoth Steppe was essentially a frozen pantry the size of a continent, packed full of nutritious vegetation that could support animal populations at a density that seems almost unbelievable by modern Arctic standards. And it supported animals in absolutely staggering numbers. When we say the Mammoth Steppe was full of wildlife, we don't mean, oh, there were some animals around. We mean it in the way you'd describe the Serengeti during the wildebeest migration, but across a territory 30 times larger, running, continuously for tens of thousands of years. Woolly mammoths moved in herds across this landscape in numbers that modern ecologists can barely model accurately. Woolly rhinoceroses, which were real animals, not a fantasy creature, and they were roughly the size of a modern white rhino but covered in thick, shaggy fur, grazed alongside them. Ancient bison, significantly larger than their modern descendants, roamed in groups that stretched to the horizon. Wild horses, the ancestors of every domestic horse alive today, were everywhere. Reindeer and giant deer, including the Irish elk with its absolutely preposterous antlers spanning up to 4 meters tip to tip, which is wider than a typical living room, picked their way across the landscape in vast seasonal migrations. This was not, to use the technical term, a chill and relaxed neighborhood. It was one of the most densely populated large mammal ecosystems Earth has ever produced. But here's what makes the Mammoth Steppe genuinely fascinating from an ecological standpoint. It wasn't just a collection of animals sharing the same address. It was a system. Every species had a role, and those roles were deeply interconnected in ways that kept the whole thing running. The large herbivores weren't just eating the grass, they were maintaining it. Mammoths and rhinos and bison were, in a very real sense, ecosystem engineers. Their grazing kept the vegetation short and mixed, preventing any single plant type from dominating and choking out the others. Their enormous bodies, moving across the landscape in herds, compacted the soil in ways that actually helped it retain nutrients. Their dung fertilized the ground on a continental scale. When a herd of several hundred mammoths passes through an area, they are not just consuming resources, they are actively reshaping the environment in ways that make it more productive for everyone else, including themselves. This is what ecologists call a megafaunal ecosystem, and it operates according to rules that are fundamentally different from the smaller-scale ecosystems we're more familiar with today. Remove the large animals and the whole system begins to unravel in ways that aren't immediately obvious, but become catastrophic over time. The vegetation changes, the soil changes, the hydrology changes. Even the permafrost, the frozen ground layer, is affected, because large animals trampling snow in winter expose the ground to colder air temperatures, which keeps the permafrost frozen. Without them, the insulating snow cover stays intact, the ground warms slightly, and the permafrost begins to thaw, which, as we'll get to in the final chapter, turns out to matter quite a lot for reasons that are extremely relevant to 2026. The Mammoth Steppe also connected the world in ways that seem remarkable when you consider how isolated many of these regions feel today. The same species of animal existed across the entire breadth of this ecosystem. The woolly mammoth wasn't a creature of Siberia and a separate but similar creature of Alaska. It was the same animal, migrating and interbreeding across a continuous landscape that had no ocean barriers, no mountain ranges impassable enough to stop it. Genetic studies of mammoth remains from Europe, Russia, and North America confirm this connectivity. These were not isolated island populations. They were part of a single, continent-spanning biological network, which is remarkable for animals that, in other configurations of geography and climate, would have been entirely separated. and the ecosystem fed itself in ways that are still being studied and understood. The cold climate was actually a feature, not a bug, for this system's productivity. Low temperatures slowed the decomposition of organic material, meaning that nutrients cycled through the system more slowly and accumulated in the soil over time rather than being rapidly broken down and lost. The deep mineral-rich soil of the Mammoth Steppe was, in some ways, the product of thousands of years of animal activity and cold-preserved organic accumulation. It was a biological savings account with a very long investment horizon, which, to extend the metaphor to its breaking point, is exactly the kind of savings account that gets wrecked when someone makes a very large withdrawal without warning. What we're building toward, and what we'll come back to in detail later, is an understanding of what happens when you remove the keystone species from a system like this. What happens when the mammoths go away? But before we get there, we need to properly meet the cast of characters that made this ecosystem so extraordinary. Because the Mammoth Steppe wasn't just about grass and herds of grazers, it had predators. And those predators were, without exaggeration, the most terrifying collection of carnivores that has walked the earth in the last several million years. Let's be very direct about something. If you somehow found yourself transported to the Mammoth Steppe, say some theoretical time travel situation that we'll absolutely not think too hard about, the experience would not be the peaceful nature documentary you might be imagining. Yes, there would be vast herds of animals stretching to the horizon. Yes, the landscape would be starkly beautiful, but the predators would immediately recalibrate your definition of what an apex carnivore is supposed to look like. Because the Ice Age did not mess around when it came to hunters. Let's start with the most famous resident of this frozen world, the woolly mammoth. Now technically, the mammoth was prey, not predator, but it deserves its moment first because everything else gets talked about relative to it. Woolly mammoths were not the largest mammoths that ever existed. That title belongs to the steppe mammoth, an earlier species that could reach shoulder heights of over 4 meters. The woolly mammoth was the smaller, hardier, cold-adapted descendant, typically about 3 to 3.5 meters at the shoulder, and weighing somewhere between 4 and 6 tons for a large adult male, which, to give you a useful reference point, is roughly the weight of 3 or 4 modern SUVs stacked on a skeleton. Not exactly something you'd want to startle accidentally. Their tusks were not decorative. Adult male woolly mammoths carried tusks that could reach over 3 meters in length, curving dramatically outward, and sometimes spiraling in ways that look frankly impractical from an engineering standpoint, but were apparently perfectly functional. For sweeping snow away from vegetation in winter, for establishing dominance over other males, and for the occasional altercation with anything foolish enough to threaten them. Fossils show healed wounds on mammoth bones that correspond to tusk strikes, meaning these animals were actively fighting each other with what were essentially bone swords. Respectfully, that's extraordinary. The woolly rhinoceros deserves far more attention than it usually gets. Most people know about woolly mammoths. Far fewer people realize that a thick-furred, 2-horned, 2-ton rhinoceros was roaming Europe and Asia at the same time, and that it was, by all available evidence, extraordinarily well suited to the cold. Woolly rhinos had a front horn that could reach over 1 meter in length, longer than most people are tall, which they used to sweep snow aside while foraging, similar to the mammoth's tusks but more compact and frankly more intimidating. Cave paintings in France and Spain, some more than 30,000 years old, show woolly rhinos with remarkable anatomical accuracy, their distinctive humped shoulders and shaggy coats rendered by artists who clearly had seen these animals up close. Whether that was by choice or unfortunate circumstance, the paintings don't specify. Now, the Irish elk. Technically not exclusively Irish, technically not only elk, it was a giant deer, Megalochirus giganteus, and it lived across Europe and Asia from about 400,000 to roughly 7,700 years ago. The reason it earns its own paragraph, or honestly its own entire documentary, is the antlers. The antlers of a fully grown adult male Irish elk had a span of up to 3.7 meters tip to tip. Nearly 4 meters of antler, balanced on the head of an animal standing about 2 meters at the shoulder. This is the kind of anatomical decision that makes you wonder what evolution was thinking. Carrying that much bone on your head while navigating a landscape of forests and gullies seems like an enormous inconvenience. But the females apparently found it appealing, which is really all evolution requires, and so the Irish elk kept making larger and larger antlers for hundreds of thousands of years, until the whole enterprise eventually stopped working when the ecosystem changed. Sexual selection. Powerful, effective, and occasionally completely ridiculous. But the herbivores, magnificent as they were, are not what kept the mammoth steppe interesting at night. For that, we turn to the predators. The cave lion, Panthera spalea, if you want to sound educated at parties, was not a subspecies of today's African lion. It was a separate species, and it was larger. Estimates suggest it exceeded modern male African lions in size by about 10 to 25%, which puts a large male cave lion at potentially 300 kilograms or more. These animals hunted across a range that stretched from Britain to Alaska, which is already impressive, and cave paintings suggest they may have had faint stripes or spots, rather than the solid tawny colour of modern lions, which is either a useful piece of zoological information or just proof that Ice Age predators were overachievers even in the aesthetics department. Cave lion bones have been found with injuries consistent with mammoth encounters. These animals were not hunting rabbits. The cave hyena was, contrary to what the word hyena might suggest if you're picturing a timid scavenger, a formidable and aggressive predator the size of a modern spotted hyena, but with stronger jaws, a broader range, and apparently absolutely no spatial boundaries. Cave hyena dens found across Europe contain the bones of horses, rhinos, and juvenile mammoths, evidence of what was genuinely a top-tier predator managing its own territory within the same landscape as lions, bears, and eventually humans. Sharing an ecosystem with cave hyenas was, to put it charitably, a challenge. And then there is the cave bear, Ursus spelaeus. If you've ever been vaguely intimidated by a modern brown bear, which, at up to 700 kilograms, is already a creature that commands enormous respect, then the cave bear would like a word. Cave bears were massive, significantly larger than modern brown bears, with males estimated at up to 1,000 kilograms in some specimens. They were primarily but not exclusively herbivorous. Their teeth suggest a diet heavy on plant material, but cave bear bones show healed injuries consistent with fighting, and their size alone would have made them formidable competition for any other large animal attempting to share space, food sources, or inconveniently cave systems. Cave bears hibernated in the same limestone caves that early humans were using for shelter, which created a recurring seasonal situation that probably nobody on either side particularly enjoyed. The caves themselves are filled with cave bear bones. They died inside them in enormous numbers, which is why we know so much about them, and also why early humans finding these places must have had a complicated reaction. The short-faced bear of North America, Arctodus simus, deserves its own category of alarm. While cave lions and cave bears were making life interesting in Eurasia, North America had developed its own premium predator package, and the short-faced bear was arguably the most imposing land carnivore of the Ice Age in the Western Hemisphere. Standing up to 1.5 meters at the shoulder just on all fours, which means it could look a tall human directly in the eyes without standing up, and weighing potentially 900 kilograms, the short-faced bear had long legs built for speed and a facial structure suggesting it could process large prey items with efficiency that was impressive from a mechanical standpoint and terrifying from every other standpoint. When the first humans crossed from Beringia into North America, they walked into a continent that contained this animal. That's a welcome party that required some serious adjustment. And no tour of Ice Age megafauna would be complete without the saber-toothed cats. Smilodon, the most famous genus, was not actually a tiger. That's a common misconception born from the nickname saber-toothed tiger that has persisted through sheer force of cultural habit. Smilodon was its own thing entirely, a heavily built muscular predator with forelimbs built more like a wrestler than a sprinter, and canine teeth that in large adults could reach 28 centimeters in length. 28 centimeters. Those weren't teeth for biting and holding. They were designed for a single, catastrophic stabbing strike aimed at the throat or underbelly of large prey. Smilodon, the evidence suggests, tackled animals the size of young mammoths and giant ground sloths. It did not sneak up on sparrows. Giant ground sloths, by the way, because we're already here and they're worth mentioning, were real animals that existed in North and South America until relatively recently in geological terms. Megatherium, the largest genus, stood about 6 meters tall when rearing up and weighed several tons. A sloth, 6 meters tall, several tons. We live on a planet that used to have several-ton sloths, and for some reason we consider this normal background information, rather than something that should be announced dramatically at least once a week. What all of these animals shared, the mammoths and rhinos, the cave lions and bears, the saber-toothed cats and giant deer, was a set of evolutionary adaptations specifically tuned to the demands of the Ice Age world. Larger bodies to retain heat more efficiently, thick fat reserves and dense fur to insulate against extreme cold. Behavioral strategies, migration, hibernation, communal living, that were precise responses to the rhythms of a glacial environment. Every one of these species was, in its own way, a masterpiece of cold weather engineering. They had been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection, working in a world of ice and sparse resources and relentless seasonal extremes. Together, they formed the most spectacular collection of large animals that has lived on land since the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago. They shared their world, preyed on each other, competed for territory, and maintained, for tens of thousands of years, a brutal but functioning equilibrium. The mammoth steppe held them all in balance, and as long as the ecosystem remained intact, the balance held. And then something arrived in the mammoth steppe that was different from everything that had come before. Small, relatively slow, not particularly strong, completely without natural armor or serious weaponry of its own. But it had fire, and it had a brain that was doing things no brain on Earth had done before. Consider the situation objectively for a moment. You have an ecosystem populated by cave lions weighing 300 kilograms, cave bears topping out at a literal ton, woolly rhinos with meter-long horns, and mammoths the size of small trucks that have been biologically optimized for cold survival over hundreds of thousands of years of meticulous evolutionary refinement. And then into this ecosystem walks a primate, hairless, clawless, no tusks, no armor, teeth so modest they couldn't even puncture thick hide without a tool, running speed roughly equivalent to a moderately motivated large dog. By any reasonable ecological assessment, this animal had absolutely no business being here, and yet, here we are. Anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, began moving into the colder northern regions of Eurasia somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 years ago. This was not their first contact with cold environments. Earlier human relatives like the Neanderthals had been living in temperate and cold climates for hundreds of thousands of years before that, which is a story worth its own video. But the full push into the deep Arctic zones of Siberia, the far north of Europe, and eventually across Beringia into the Americas represents one of the most audacious ecological expansions in the history of our species. Modern humans did not slowly evolve cold tolerance over thousands of generations the way mammoths did. They showed up equipped with technology and social organization and a capacity for planning that evolution had never produced in any other animal before, and they decided that was sufficient. Extraordinarily, they were right. The single most important technology in this story is fire. Not the discovery of fire. Humans and their ancestors had been using fire for potentially 1 million years before the Ice Age peak. But the mastery of fire, the ability to sustain it reliably, carry embers when moving camp, build it in wet or windy conditions, and use it not just for warmth, but as a tool for processing materials, shaping weapons and cooking food. This level of fire control was what made cold climate survival possible without biological cold adaptation. A fire burning in a cave or a skin-covered shelter on a Siberian plain at -35 degrees is doing the work that 2 centimeters of body fat and a triple-layer coat of fur does for a mammoth. The humans, in effect, outsourced their cold protection to a technology they could carry and reproduce on demand, instead of growing it on their bodies. This is, when you think about it, a completely absurd and brilliant solution to the problem of surviving in a hostile climate. No other animal had ever done anything like it. A bear grows thicker fur in preparation for winter. That's a biological response operating on evolutionary timescales. A human looks at a pile of dry grass and a couple of flintstones and decides that's equivalent. And the remarkable thing is that it worked. Not just worked, it gave humans flexibility that no amount of biological adaptation could match. A mammoth's cold tolerance is fixed by its genetics. A human's cold tolerance scales with the technology available, which means it can improve within a single lifetime, within a single generation, by sharing and refining techniques. But fire alone couldn't solve every problem the Arctic presented. Shelter was equally critical. Early humans in the far north couldn't rely on caves everywhere they went. The landscape of the mammoth steppe was largely open grassland, not limestone cast full of conveniently located rock shelters, so they built. And what they built in regions where the only available structural material was what the landscape provided, was something that should genuinely be more famous than it is: houses made of mammoth bones. Archaeological sites in Ukraine, the Czech Republic, and Russia, some dating to 15,000 to 25,000 years ago, contain the remains of circular or oval structures built from the bones and skulls of woolly mammoths, with the framework likely covered by hides stretched and lashed into place to create a weatherproof outer shell. Some of these structures use dozens of individual mammoths' worth of bones in a single dwelling. The skulls, femurs, shoulder blades, and tusks were arranged with clear structural intent. Heavier bones at the base, lighter bones or jaw segments used for framing, tusks arching overhead to form the roof supports. These were not accidental piles of bones. They were engineered structures, planned and constructed with an understanding of load-bearing and weatherproofing that is, frankly, impressive for people working without blueprints, power tools, or the ability to order structural components from a supplier. The Mazhirish site in Ukraine, discovered in 1965 when a farmer digging his cellar hit something hard and found he'd accidentally excavated a 15,000-year-old mammoth bone house, which is both the best and worst way to learn about archaeology, contained the remains of 4 separate structures. The largest used bones from at least 15 individual mammoths. Inside, researchers found hearth areas, storage pits dug into the permafrost to keep food cold, and evidence of long-term occupation through multiple winters. These were not emergency shelters, they were homes, deliberately built, carefully maintained, and apparently comfortable enough to return to season after season. Not exactly a Manhattan apartment, but considerably more sophisticated than what most people imagine when they picture Ice Age humans. The clothing situation was equally non-trivial and equally impressive. Surviving Arctic winters in clothing made from animal hides is not a matter of simply wrapping yourself in a fur and hoping for the best. Clothing that actually keeps you alive at -40 has to be tailored. It has to fit closely enough to trap body heat without restricting movement. Seams have to be tight enough to prevent cold air from penetrating. Multiple layers are required, with specific materials chosen for specific functions: an inner layer that wicks moisture away from the skin, a middle layer for insulation, an outer layer for wind and water resistance. The Inuit and other Arctic peoples who developed cold climate clothing technologies over thousands of years created garments of extraordinary sophistication, and the Ice Age humans of Siberia and northern Europe were doing the same thing, in the same climate with the same basic raw materials tens of thousands of years earlier. We know this because of needles. Bone needles, thin, precisely manufactured, with a punch die for threading sinew, appear in the archaeological record across northern Eurasia, starting around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, coinciding almost exactly with the expansion of modern humans into cold regions. A bone needle is not a tool for making rough tied-together hides. It is a tool for sewing tailored, fitted clothing with tight, weatherproof seams. The existence of needles in the archaeological record is direct physical evidence of sophisticated textile technology. The people making these needles were not struggling to survive, they were manufacturing specialized cold weather gear. The needles themselves, often just a few centimeters long and a millimeter or two wide, required significant skill to produce from bone without snapping them. Finding one in a dig is, to an archaeologist, like finding a receipt for a North Face jacket. It tells you exactly what kind of clothing culture you're dealing with. The stone tools of Ice Age humans are perhaps the most extensively studied aspect of their technology, and with good reason, stone preserves better than anything else, and the progression of tool-making techniques across the Ice Age record is one of the clearest windows we have into the development of human cognitive abilities. The flint and obsidian points that Ice Age hunters napped into shape were not crude rocks chipped into a vaguely pointy form. The best examples of Upper Paleolithic tool-making, the Solutrean points of Western Europe, produced roughly 20,000 to 17,000 years ago, are so thin, so precisely symmetrical, and so finely worked that modern flint knappers attempting to replicate them regularly fail and break the piece. These objects required planning multiple steps ahead, the ability to visualize the finished form inside the raw stone before starting, and a level of fine motor control and spatial reasoning that, if you showed the finished product to someone without context, they would probably assume required metal tools to make. They would be wrong. The hunters who carried these points were not operating alone. one of the most important and underappreciated aspects of Ice Age human survival is how thoroughly social it was. Everything worked because of groups. Fire was maintained collectively. Shelters were built by multiple people working together. Hunting strategies for large prey, strategies we'll examine in detail in the next chapter, required coordinated action, shared knowledge, and long-term planning across multiple individuals. Ice Age humans transmitted information between generations not through genetic programming but through teaching, showing a child how to knap flint, how to read animal tracks, how to find flint outcrops in an unfamiliar landscape. This sounds obvious because we do it constantly. But in evolutionary terms, the degree to which Ice Age humans depended on culturally transmitted knowledge for their survival, rather than instinct or genetic programming, was genuinely unprecedented. Researchers studying the cognitive demands of Ice Age life have argued plausibly that the extreme pressures of cold climate survival actively drove the development of human intelligence in ways that warmer environments simply couldn't match. The problem of staying alive through a Siberian winter requires forward planning on a scale of months. It requires the ability to model future scenarios, to think in October about what February is going to look like and prepare accordingly. It requires abstract reasoning about resources that aren't present yet. How many hides will we need for a new shelter? How much dried meat to store? Where are the reindeer herds going to be when we need them? These are not simple immediate response problems. They are complex planning problems that reward a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that can hold multiple future scenarios in mind simultaneously, evaluate them, and make decisions about the present based on projected future outcomes. The Ice Age, in other words, was not just a backdrop for human survival, it was an intelligence pressure cooker. The species that made it through the cold, that built bone houses and sewed fitted clothing and made tools that modern craftspeople struggle to replicate, was not the same species that had first wandered out of Africa. The extreme demands of glacial life had, over tens of thousands of years, sharpened human cognition in ways that would eventually produce writing, mathematics, cities, and, much later, the internet. Which means that in a very real sense, everything you're watching this video on, every screen, every device, every piece of technology in your life, has a direct ancestral debt to the people who figured out how to survive on a frozen continent with nothing but fire and the contents of their own heads. That is not a small debt. Let's set the scene. You weigh about 70 kilograms. You have no claws, no venom, no natural armor of any kind. Your top running speed, if you're having a genuinely excellent day, is maybe 30 kilometers per hour, which is flattering compared to most prey animals and would be immediately humiliating compared to any predator you might need to outrun. Your weapons are a spear with a sharpened stone tip, a hand-thrown dart, and whatever your companions are carrying. Now imagine the animal you've decided to hunt weighs 6 tons, stands 3.5 meters at the shoulder, carries meter-long tusks that have been described, accurately, as we established earlier, as functional bone swords, and is surrounded by a protective herd of other animals that are also 6 tons and also have bone swords. This was not an extreme sport. This was Tuesday. The fact that Ice Age humans hunted woolly mammoths at all is remarkable. The fact that they did it successfully, repeatedly, across multiple continents, for tens of thousands of years, using technologies that we would today classify as primitive, is a testament to something that no other predator on the mammoth steppe possessed in anything close to the same measure: strategic intelligence applied at scale. Because here's the critical thing to understand about mammoth hunting. It was not a spontaneous event. It was not a case of a group of hunters stumbling across a mammoth and deciding to give it a try. A successful mammoth hunt was the result of days or weeks of systematic observation, careful planning, site selection, coordination, and execution. A process that looked less like predation and more like a military operation conducted by people who had been studying the target's behavior for most of their lives and had a multi-generational knowledge base of how these animals moved, where they went, and what made them vulnerable. The hunters tracked herds carefully, often following the same groups of animals across vast stretches of the steppe, learning individual animals the way a skilled naturalist learns a population. They read prints in snow and mud, identified grazed vegetation, noted the age and direction of dung deposits to estimate how recently a herd had passed and how fast it was moving. They watched from distances that kept them invisible to the herd, studying who was limping, who had visible ribs suggesting poor condition going into winter, who was young enough or old enough to be separated from the protective core of the group, with some careful manoeuvring. The weak, the old, the injured, these were the targets. Not because Ice Age hunters were incapable of taking a healthy adult, but because a healthy adult in the centre of a protective herd was a genuinely dangerous proposition, and the hunters were not interested in unnecessary casualties. They were strategic. They thought like ecosystems managers long before that concept had name. The actual mechanics of a mammoth hunt varied by terrain, season, and group size, but several strategies emerge repeatedly in the archaeological and experimental record. One of the most effective was the use of natural landscape features to remove an animal's greatest defensive advantages: its size, its strength, and its ability to simply walk away from anything that bothered it. Mammoths were powerful, but they were not nimble. Steep riverbanks, boggy ground, narrow gorges, terrain that a human could navigate on foot with relative ease, became serious obstacles for an animal weighing several tons. Archaeological sites show kill locations disproportionately clustered near river bends, gullies, and areas of soft ground. The hunters weren't just finding mammoths. They were steering them toward places where the mammoth's size became a liability instead of an asset. Fire was an important tool in this steering process, though it requires care to discuss accurately. The archaeological evidence for deliberate fire use in mammoth drives is suggestive rather than conclusive, but experimental archaeology and the study of how other cultures have used fire in large game hunting makes the inference reasonable. A line of fire on the right side of a moving animal, maintained and directed by hunters working in coordination, can guide that animal toward a specific destination with considerable reliability. The mammoth didn't know it was being herded. It just knew fire was uncomfortable and it was moving away from it. By the time the animal reached the boggy ground or the narrow gorge or the steep riverbank at the end of the drive, the outcome had been decided hundreds of meters upstream. The kill itself, when it came, was not quick or clean by modern standards. A spear, even an expertly made one launched with force by a skilled hunter, could not kill a mammoth with a single strike the way a high-powered rifle round can. What Ice Age spears and atlatl darts could do was penetrate the hide and muscle of a mammoth and cause serious internal damage, particularly to organs and blood vessels, that would result in the animal's death over a period of minutes to hours rather. Then instantly, multiple hunters throwing multiple projectiles over an extended period, targeting the flanks and the area behind the shoulder where vital organs were most accessible, was the process. It required sustained courage, staying in throwing range of an animal that was actively trying to escape and possibly trying to defend itself, and the ability to coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously to prevent the animal from focusing on and charging any single hunter. The relationship between Ice Age hunters and the animals they killed was not purely transactional, and the archaeological evidence is remarkably consistent on this point across multiple cultures and time periods. Sites where mammoth kills occurred frequently show evidence of ritual behavior. Bones placed in specific arrangements that have no practical explanation, red ochre pigment applied to remains, deliberate preservation of certain skeletal elements in ways that suggest significance beyond simple material use. This isn't projection of modern sensibilities onto ancient people. It's what the physical record actually shows. The people who hunted these animals apparently understood them as something more than resources. The hunt, and the animal at the centre of it, occupied a place in their mental and spiritual landscape that we can only partially reconstruct from the physical residue they left behind. What we can reconstruct much more completely is the extraordinary efficiency with which a killed mammoth was utilised. Because if you're going to take on the risk, the effort, and the coordination required to bring down one of the largest animals on the continent, you are absolutely not wasting any of it. The degree of comprehensive resource extraction that mammoth hunters practiced is, by modern standards, almost incomprehensible. We throw away a staggering proportion of every animal we consume. Ice Age hunters threw away essentially nothing. The meat was the most immediate return, hundreds of kilograms of it from a single animal, which could feed a group of several dozen people for weeks if preserved properly. Preservation in an Ice Age environment was, conveniently, not a complex problem. The ambient temperature was the freezer. Meat packed into snow or buried in permafrost could last for months. Fat, the thick deposits under the skin and around the organs, was rendered into oil that served double duty as both high-calorie food and fuel for lamps. The small stone lamps found at Ice Age sites, burning animal fat through a twisted moss or plant fibre wick were the primary light source for people living through months of near-total Arctic darkness. The mammoth's fat layer, in other words, was literally illuminating human existence. The hide was one of the most valuable materials the hunt produced. A mammoth hide was large, the skin of a full-grown adult covered an enormous area, and it was thick and durable in ways that smaller animal hides were not. Processed and tanned, it provided material for shelters, clothing, bags, and bindings. The processing of a mammoth hide was itself a significant undertaking, scraping, softening, treating with fat or brains to prevent stiffening, and represented hours of skilled labour that would have been distributed across multiple members of the group. This was not individual effort. The mammoth fed the whole community and the whole community processed it. The bones and tusks went further than most people realise. We've already discussed the use of mammoth bones in construction, the dwelling frameworks that use skulls and femurs and shoulder blades as structural elements. But bone was also raw material for tools, needles, handles, and the carved figurines and decorative objects that Ice Age artists produced in considerable numbers. Mammoth ivory, the tusks, was one of the premier artistic materials of the Paleolithic world. Carved ivory figurines, some of them among the oldest undisputed works of representational art in human history, have been found at sites across Europe and Russia. The famous figurines from the Swabian Jura in southwestern Germany, dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, include animals and human forms carved from mammoth ivory with technical skill that is startling given their age. The tusks that swept snow aside on the steppe ended up as objects of beauty, as art, as items that someone clearly valued enough to spend hours crafting with stone tools, and that we're still looking at, still studying, still finding remarkable. 40 millennia later. Even the sinew, the tough connective tissue running through the muscles, was collected and processed into thread for sewing, bindings for tool handles, and bowstrings. Sinew is extraordinarily strong for its weight, doesn't stretch when dry, and was essentially the high-performance synthetic fibre of the Ice Age. Nothing that could be used was left behind. The concept of a carcass in the modern sense, something discarded after the useful parts are removed, simply didn't exist in this context. The mammoth was a warehouse. The hunters were the most efficient logistics operation in the Northern Hemisphere. What strikes researchers studying this relationship most forcefully is not just the efficiency, but the intimacy of it. These hunters knew mammoths in a way that no one alive today knows any wild animal. They had watched herds their entire lives, learned the individual personalities and hierarchies within groups, understood the seasonal rhythms of movement and feeding and reproduction. The mammoth was simultaneously prey and, by any reasonable interpretation of the evidence, an object of profound significance. The care with which remains were sometimes treated, the frequency with which mammoths appear in Ice Age art, the recurring motif of the hunt in cave paintings created far from any practical need for hunting instruction. All of this points to a relationship between hunter and hunted that doesn't map neatly onto any category we use today. It wasn't conservation in the modern sense. These hunters killed what they needed and didn't particularly worry about sustainability in the way we use that word. It wasn't reverence in any formal religious sense we could identify. It was something older and more complicated, a recognition perhaps that your survival was bound up with the survival of something vastly larger and more powerful than yourself, and that this fact deserved acknowledgement. The hunt was practical, yes, but it was also, by every indication the evidence provides, meaningful. And the meaning they made from it, the art, the ritual, the accumulated knowledge of how to survive alongside the largest animals on Earth, was about to find a new form of expression. On the walls of caves in pigments made from iron ore and charcoal and animal fat, illuminated by the same mammoth oil lamps that kept the dark at bay, the people of the Ice Age were about to do something that no living creature had done before in the entire history of life on this planet. They were about to make art. In December 1994, 3 cavers exploring a limestone cliff face in the Ardèche Valley of southern France pushed through a narrow opening they hadn't noticed before, and found themselves in a passage that led deeper into the rock. They followed it with their headlamps, the passage widened, and then, as one of them, a man named Jean-Marie Chauvet, raised his light toward the walls, he saw something that stopped all 3 of them cold. Paintings. Hundreds of paintings covering the walls and ceiling of a series of interconnected chambers stretching hundreds of meters into the hillside. Rhinoceroses, lions, mammoths, horses, bears, ibex, rendered in black and red pigment with a fluency and confidence that would not have looked out of place in an art school portfolio. And the paintings were not recent. Radiocarbon dating would later establish that the oldest of them were approximately 36,000 years old, which means that a human being crawled into that cave with a lamp made of animal fat, mixed pigment from ground ochre and charcoal, and painted lions on a rock wall more than 36 millennia before anyone reading this was born. Take a moment with that number. 36,000 years. Agriculture is about 12,000 years old. The pyramids are about 4,500 years old. The Roman Empire, which feels ancient, lasted about 500 years. Whatever you consider to be the deep past of human civilization fits comfortably, several times over, within the time gap between us and the artist who painted those rhinos in the Chauvet cave. We're not looking at the early, clumsy beginnings of human creativity when we look at Ice Age cave art. We are looking at its full maturity, already achieved, in a period so remote that everything that happened afterward is essentially recent news. The Chauvet cave is the oldest major decorated cave currently known, but it is far from alone. The Lascaux cave in the Dordogne region of France, discovered in 1940 by a group of teenagers following their dog into a hole in the ground, which is either the best or most terrifying way to make an archaeological discovery depending on your perspective, contains nearly 2,000 separate images dating to roughly 17,000 years ago. The Altamira cave in northern Spain, whose painted ceiling caused such astonishment when it was first seriously examined in the 1870s that the scientific establishment initially refused to believe the paintings were prehistoric, contains bison, painted with a naturalism so accomplished that the researcher who first studied them, Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola, spent years being publicly mocked before the scientific community grudgingly admitted he was right. The bison were genuinely ancient. The mockery was not the field's finest hour. These three sites are simply the famous ones. There are hundreds of decorated caves and rock shelters across Europe, from Spain and Portugal in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, spanning a period from roughly 40,000 to about 10,000 years ago. And the art they contain is, without exception, far more sophisticated than what most people expect when they imagine what prehistoric art should look like. The mental image most people carry, a blobby, childlike outline of an animal scratched clumsily into rock, is essentially the opposite of what Ice Age art actually is. The technical vocabulary these artists deployed is extraordinary. They use perspective, or something functionally equivalent to it, rendering legs on the far side of an animal smaller than those on the near side to suggest depth. They used the natural contours of cave walls, bulges, ridges, shallow depressions in the rock, as three-dimensional foundations for their images, so that a rounded protrusion became the back of a bison, a curved ceiling crack became the spine of a horse. The result was not flat painting, but something closer to relief sculpture with painted detail, figures that seemed to emerge from the rock rather than sit on its surface. Some researchers have argued that when viewed by the flickering light of a fat lamp, the only illumination these artists and their audiences would have had, the figures appear to move, their outlines shifting subtly as the light source shifts. Whether or not that was the deliberate intention, it is the effect. The pigments themselves required sophisticated preparation. Red and yellow tones came from iron oxide minerals, ochre, hematite, ground into powder and mixed with animal fat, plant juices, or water into a paste that could be applied with fingers, sticks, pads of moss or fur, or blown through a hollow bone. Tube onto the wall in a spray technique that, if you described it without context, sounds like it was invented by a 20th century aerosol artist, rather than a Paleolithic one. Black came primarily from manganese dioxide or charcoal, white from kaolin clay. The fact that these pigments have survived on cave walls for tens of thousands of years is partly a testament to the stable, humidity-controlled environment inside deep limestone caves, and partly a testament to the quality of the pigment preparation itself. These were not accidental marks that happened to last. They were carefully made objects designed to last, in a medium chosen at least partly for its durability. Now here's the question that has occupied researchers, archaeologists, and frankly anyone who has ever stood in front of one of these paintings and felt the hairs on their arms stand up. What were they for? The honest answer is that we don't know definitively, and anyone who tells you otherwise is probably oversimplifying. But the evidence points in several directions simultaneously, and the most compelling interpretation is that Ice Age cave art was doing multiple things at once, the way all genuinely important human cultural productions tend to do multiple things at once because the people creating them were as complex as we are. One function that is difficult to dismiss is information storage. The animals depicted in Ice Age art are overwhelmingly the animals that were hunted or that posed danger: mammoths, bison, horses, rhinos, cave lions, bears. They are depicted with a level of anatomical accuracy that speaks to close, sustained observation. The musculature is right, the proportions are right, the behavioral postures are recognizable to zoologists studying the same species today from fossil. Skeletal material. A painting of a woolly rhinoceros in Chauvet shows the distinctive shoulder hump and the relative proportions of the front and rear horn with precision that matches what we know from frozen specimens. This is not the work of someone who saw a rhinoceros once briefly. This is the work of someone who had watched rhinoceroses carefully for a long time and remembered what they looked like in detail, accurate enough to reconstruct from memory in low light on an uneven rock surface. These images were knowledge. They encoded detailed information about animals in a form that could be preserved, referred to, and transmitted to people who had not personally observed the subjects. The location of cave art within the cave systems is also informative about function. Many of the most dramatic paintings are not near the entrances, not in easily accessible chambers. They are deep inside the cave systems, in passages that required crawling, squeezing through tight gaps, and navigating in near total darkness to reach. This is not where you put a decoration. This is where you put something that access to is itself significant. The journey into the cave, the physical ordeal of reaching the painted chambers, the disorientation and sensory deprivation of deep cave environments, all of this suggests that the context of viewing these images was ritualized, that the experience of encountering them was meant to be challenging and transformative rather than casual and convenient. These were not gallery walls, they were destinations that had to be earned. The recurring presence of human hand stencils across dozens of sites adds another layer to this interpretation. By placing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it, Ice Age artists left a negative outline of their hand, a mark of presence, of identity, of having been here, in this specific place, at this specific moment. It is one of the most direct acts of personal expression in the archaeological record, and it is spread across 30,000 years of human activity in decorated caves. The same gesture, repeated by different people across an unimaginable span of time, in different caves across an entire continent. I was here. I made this. We're connected across time by the outline of a human hand on a rock surface, and the weight of that continuity is not something that's easy to process without some kind of emotional response. Beyond the purely practical and the ceremonial, Ice Age art was also, and this seems important to say, beautiful. Not accidentally, not incidentally, but as a central part of what it was doing. The artists made choices about composition, colour, line quality, and placement that reflect aesthetic judgment. They revised and improved their work. The Lascaux Hall of the Bulls, a chamber whose ceiling is covered with enormous black outline paintings of aurochs, horses, deer, and a large rhinoceros, arranged with a visual dynamism that feels genuinely designed rather than randomly. Accumulated is not just a successful information delivery system. It is visually stunning in a way that operates completely independently of any intellectual understanding of what you're looking at. You don't need to know anything about the Ice Age or Paleolithic art to stand in that chamber and feel something. That response is not culturally constructed. It is, in the most literal sense, ancient. The art of the Ice Age was the first library, as we mentioned at the top of this chapter, but that undersells it slightly. Libraries store information passively. Ice Age cave art stored information, transmitted cultural knowledge, served ceremonial functions, marked territory, recorded individual presence, and also operated as art in the full aesthetic sense of the word. It was doing simultaneously everything that we use writing, religion, ritual, and visual culture to do today. In a world without writing, without formal institutions, without the infrastructure we use to organize and transmit collective human knowledge, these paintings were the entire system. All of it, on the walls of a cave illuminated by a burning lump of fat, created by people whose names we will never know, whose languages are lost beyond any recovery, whose daily lives we can only partially reconstruct from the objects they left behind. What they left behind is enough to know that they were fully human. Not proto-human, not cognitively limited ancestors fumbling towards sophistication. Fully, recognizably, unmistakably human. People who looked at a rock wall and saw a canvas, who looked at a dead animal and felt something beyond hunger, who looked at the world they lived in and decided that it was worth recording in a form that would outlast them by tens of thousands of years. They were right. The paintings survived. The animals they painted did not. And understanding why those animals disappeared, who or what was responsible for the most dramatic extinction event since the dinosaurs, is the question that the next part of this story is building toward. At this point in our story, we've established a world of extraordinary cold, kilometers of ice reshaping continents, mammoths engineered to molecular perfection for Arctic survival, humans carving out existence with fire and ingenuity in conditions that would hospitalize most modern people within hours. It would be easy to imagine the Ice Age as a stable, frozen state, cold locked in, life adapting to it, everything proceeding at glacial pace in every sense. But here's the thing about a planet with a molten interior sitting under a multi-kilometer crust of ice. The situation underground was never stable, not for a single geological moment. Because while the surface of the Earth was doing its best impression of a planetary freezer, the interior was doing what it always does, convecting, churning, building pressure, and periodically deciding that the most efficient solution to that pressure was to punch a hole through the crust and erupt several hundred cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Volcanoes, it turns out, have very little interest in the climate conditions on the surface. They have their own schedule, and they keep to it regardless of whether the area above them is currently buried under an ice sheet. The collision between these two forces, the deep geological fire underneath and the accumulated ice on top, produced some of the most dramatic, strange, and consequential geological events in the planet's recent history. And it also, somewhat perversely, helped set up the conditions that would eventually feed the first human civilizations. More on that shortly. Let's start with the basic dynamic, because it's counterintuitive in a way that becomes obvious once someone explains it, and then seems like it should have been obvious all along. Ice sheets are heavy. We've established this in some detail earlier. The Laurentide ice sheet was pressing North America down by hundreds of meters under its weight. That weight matters to volcanoes in a direct and measurable way, because the pressure of all that ice on the crust actually suppresses volcanic activity in the regions it covers. The weight acts like a lid on a pot, not sealing it completely, but making it harder for magma to push through. When ice sheets are at their maximum extent, volcanic activity in glaciated regions tends to be somewhat reduced compared to ice-free periods, not because the magma has gone anywhere, but because the barriers to eruption are higher. Now take away the ice. As glacial periods end and ice sheets melt, the pressure on the crust drops, dramatically, over geologically short timescales. This is called glacial isostatic adjustment, and we've already discussed one of its effects, the crust bouncing back upward as the load is removed. But the other effect is that the pressure-suppressing volcanic activity in the upper mantle drops at the same time. Reduce the pressure on hot, partially molten rock that has been wanting to erupt for thousands of years, and what do you think happens? It erupts. More of it, more often, with more violence than before. Studies of volcanic records from Iceland, which sits directly on a major volcanic hotspot and has one of the most complete and well-studied eruption histories in the world, show a striking pattern. During the peak glacial period, Icelandic volcanic activity was significantly reduced compared to baseline. As the ice sheets melted following the last glacial maximum, roughly between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, Icelandic volcanic activity spiked dramatically, possibly increasing by a factor of 30 to 50 compared to the glacial suppressed baseline. Not slightly more volcanic, spectacularly, almost absurdly more volcanic. Iceland was, for a period following deglaciation, essentially making up for lost time at a pace that makes modern Icelandic volcanism look like a slow news day. This Iceland example is useful partly because it's well documented, and partly because Iceland's position, straddling the mid-Atlantic ridge, rising from the ocean floor as one of the most volcanically productive places on the planet, makes it an extreme case of a pattern that occurred at a smaller scale wherever ice sheets overlaid geologically active crust. The regions of North America that hosted major volcanic systems under the Laurentide ice sheet showed similar, if less extreme, patterns of increased activity following glacial retreat. The relationship between ice and fire is not metaphorical. It is a measurable, documented, geologically significant feedback loop. But the interesting question for the story of the Ice Age as humans experienced it is not what happens when ice melts and volcanoes wake up. It's what volcanoes were doing during the cold periods themselves, in regions not covered by ice, and what their eruptions did to a climate already operating at the extreme end of cold. Because large volcanic eruptions are, among other things, extraordinarily effective cooling agents. And injecting a major cooling event into an already glacial climate is not a subtle thing. When a large volcano erupts explosively, it drives enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere, the upper layer of the atmosphere, above the weather systems that would otherwise wash it back down relatively quickly. In the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide converts to sulfate aerosols, tiny particles that reflect incoming solar radiation back into space before it reaches the surface. The result is a reduction in global average temperature that can last for 1 to 3 years, depending on the scale of the eruption and the amount of material injected. You may have encountered this phenomenon in the context of the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which triggered the year without a summer in 1816, widespread crop failures, famine, and the coldest summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere in over a century. Tambora was a very large eruption. In the context of the Ice Age, it would have been a medium-sized inconvenience. The Toba supervolcano eruption, which occurred approximately 74,000 years ago in what is now Sumatra, Indonesia, was not a medium-sized inconvenience. It was the largest known volcanic eruption in the past several million years, a cataclysm that ejected somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 cubic kilometers of material, compared to about 150 cubic kilometers for Tambora. The Toba eruption deposited a layer of ash across an enormous swath of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean that is still identifiable in geological cores today as a distinct marker horizon, a geological timestamp visible across an entire hemisphere. The sulfate aerosol veil it generated in the stratosphere is estimated to have reduced global temperatures by somewhere between 3 and 10 degrees Celsius for a period of years following the eruption, with some models suggesting a potential volcanic winter lasting up to a decade. Here is where the timing matters enormously. Toba erupted not during an interglacial, not during a period of planetary warmth, but during an already cold period within the Ice Age cycle. The planet was already running cold. Reduced summer insolation was already limiting ice melt, and then a supervolcano added several degrees of additional cooling on top of an already glacial baseline. The combination was, by any honest assessment, brutal. Genetic evidence has suggested, though this remains debated, that the Toba eruption may have caused a severe bottleneck in human populations, potentially reducing our ancestors to a small number of surviving groups in refugia where the effects were less severe. Whether or not the specific genetic bottleneck hypothesis holds up as research continues, the basic picture is not in dispute. Toba erupted during an already difficult period for life in the northern and central parts of the Eastern Hemisphere. It made things considerably worse, and the evidence of its impact is written in rock and ice cores across the entire planet. Not all volcanic interactions with the Ice Age were this catastrophic. Smaller eruptions, which is to say, eruptions in the range of what we consider very large by modern standards, occurred regularly throughout the glacial period and had more localized but still significant effects. Eruptions in Iceland and in the volcanic arcs of Alaska and the Pacific Northwest during the glacial maximum produced lava flows that interacted with glaciers in ways that generated genuinely extreme landscapes. When lava flows onto ice or under a glacier, the rapid cooling creates distinctive formations: pillow lavas, hyaloclastite ridges, table mountains called tuyas, that are essentially frozen records of the encounter between fire and ice. Iceland is full of them. The flat-topped volcanic mountains that give Iceland much of its distinctive landscape are tuyas. Volcanoes that erupted under ice sheets were contained by the ice as they built upward and emerged at the top into open air, producing the characteristic flat summit that marks the point at which the eruption punched through the ice surface. The lava-on-ice interaction also produced enormous quantities of meltwater, sometimes catastrophically. A subglacial eruption in Iceland can melt tens of cubic kilometers of ice in a matter of hours, producing a sudden flood called a jökullaup, essentially a glacial outburst flood triggered by volcanic heating, rather than by the gradual warming we discussed in the context of ice sheet retreat. These floods, historically measured in Iceland during historical eruptions and now studied in ancient geological records, carried water volumes comparable to large river systems, lasting for hours to days, sweeping material from under the ice sheet to the coast with a force that reshaped the landscape permanently. The Icelandic coastline has been restructured by Jökulhlaup so many times that the interactions of volcanism and glaciation are essentially written into the topography of the island. And now for the part that seems like a cruel joke but is actually just geology being its usual complicated long-game self. All of that volcanic activity, the eruptions, the ash layers, the lava flows, the interaction with ice, wasn't purely destructive from a long-term perspective. Volcanic ash is extraordinarily mineral-rich. It contains phosphorus, calcium, potassium, iron, and other nutrients that are often depleted in soils that have been heavily leached by rain or locked under glaciers for thousands of years. When volcanic ash settles on land and weathers over decades and centuries, it releases those minerals into the soil in forms that plants can use. Volcanic soils, andisols, in the technical classification, are among the most fertile soils on Earth. The regions that received repeated ash deposits from Ice Age volcanic activity in places like Central America, Japan, Indonesia, the Pacific Northwest, and parts of Europe developed soil profiles of extraordinary productivity over the millennia. Following the glacial period, this is the dark irony of the volcanic contribution to Ice Age Earth. The same eruptions that caused short-term catastrophe, cooling, crop failures, and population stress were simultaneously building the soil bank that would, thousands of years later, support the population densities that made agriculture and civilization possible. The volcanic ash that darkened skies and killed growing seasons was also the slow-release fertilizer deposit that future farmers would inherit without knowing where it came from. Geology playing the very long game, making investments in soil productivity on timescales that span human civilizations from their beginning to their present, distributing the returns across populations that had no idea the original deposit had been made. The planet was not a passive stage on which the Ice Age drama played out. It was an active participant, with the deep geological systems and the surface climate systems operating on overlapping timescales, responding to each other, amplifying and dampening each other's effects in ways that are still being mapped and understood. The ice shaped the volcanism shaped the ice, and both of them shaped the world that humans inherited when the big melt finally came, which, as it turned out, was not a gentle process. Every culture on Earth that has a written tradition old enough to preserve genuinely ancient stories has some version of the same event in its mythology, a great flood, waters rising beyond anything previously known. A world transformed, a familiar landscape submerged, a before and after so dramatic that the memory of it embedded itself into the foundational stories of civilizations separated by entire oceans. The Mesopotamian flood narratives that predate and almost certainly influenced the biblical story of Noah, the Deucalion flood in Greek mythology, flood myths in Hindu tradition, in Chinese legend, in the oral histories of indigenous peoples across the Americas and Australia. For a long time, scholars treated these as either purely symbolic religious narratives or as reflections of local flooding events, rivers breaking their banks, a particularly bad storm surge. The kind of thing that's memorable and traumatic but not literally planetary in scale. Those scholars were, with respect, thinking too small. Because the end of the last ice age was a flooding event of literally planetary scale, occurring over a period of thousands of years but punctuated by episodes of catastrophic, sudden inundation that happened fast enough to be experienced within individual human lifetimes. People watched coastlines they had known since childhood disappear underwater. Islands appeared where there had been hills on a continuous plain. Hunting grounds that generations of ancestors had used became ocean floor within decades. This was not metaphor. This was what actually happened to the physical world between roughly 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, and the people who lived through it remembered it, told their children about it, and those children told their children, in an unbroken chain of traumatic collective memory that may well be the oldest preserved human historical account in existence. Let's reconstruct the sequence, because the actual mechanism of how the Ice Age ended is more complicated and more violent than most people realise. The glacial maximum, the peak of ice extent, occurred roughly 20,000 years ago. After that point, the orbital forcing we discussed way back at the beginning of this video began shifting in the other direction. More summer insolation hitting the northern hemisphere, slightly more warmth, slightly more ice melting each summer than was replenished each winter. The ice sheets began to retreat. This process was not, however, a smooth and steady thaw. It was a series of fits and starts, interrupted by abrupt cold reversals that halted or temporarily reversed the retreat, and punctuated by sudden warmings that accelerated melting at rates that are genuinely alarming to read about in the geological record. One of the most dramatic of these acceleration events is called Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred approximately 14,650 years ago and lasted about 500 years. During this relatively brief episode, global sea levels rose by somewhere between 16 and 25 metres. Do not skim past that number. That is a sea level rise of potentially 25 metres in 500 years. That's not a gradual change that allows coastal communities to adapt over generations. That is a rate of change that would have transformed coastlines within individual human lifetimes, visibly, dramatically, and permanently. Where exactly this meltwater came from, which ice sheets contributed most to this sudden pulse, remains a subject of active research. The candidates include portions of the Laurentide ice sheet in North America, the West Antarctic ice sheet, or some combination of both. What is not disputed is that it happened, that it was fast by any reasonable standard, and that its effects on human populations living along coastlines and river deltas worldwide would have been severe and traumatic. And the mechanism that produced the most sudden and localized flooding events during the deglaciation was not gradual ice melting at all. It was ice dam failure. Remember Lake Agassiz, the enormous glacial lake we mentioned in the early chapters, the one that was at its maximum larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, holding more fresh water than exists in all of Earth's lakes today? Lake Agassiz and several other enormous glacial lakes in North America and Eurasia were held in place by ice dams, sections of the retreating ice sheet that still blocked natural drainage routes. As long as those ice dams held, the lakes stayed behind them, growing larger as meltwater poured in from the retreating glaciers upstream. When those ice dams failed, and they did fail repeatedly as the ice thinned and weakened, the results were not polite. The drainage of Lake Agassiz occurred in multiple episodes, the largest of which may have released the entire contents of the lake in a period of months to perhaps a few years. The volume of water involved is almost beyond meaningful description. Estimates suggest the largest single outburst drainage event could have released enough fresh water to raise global sea levels by 1 to 3 metres in a very short period of time. The water moved through newly opened drainage routes at speeds and volumes that scoured the landscape to bedrock, left behind deposits of sediment hundreds of metres thick, and carved features that are still visible in the topography of the northern United States and Canada today. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington state, a bizarre, deeply eroded landscape of dry canyons, gravel bars the size of hills, and grooved bedrock that completely baffled geologists for decades, were carved by exactly this kind of catastrophic glacial outburst flood from a separate lake called Glacial Lake Missoula, whose ice dam in what is now Montana failed repeatedly over thousands of years, each time releasing a flood whose peak discharge exceeded the combined flow of all the rivers on Earth today, all of them, combined simultaneously as a single flood event from one lake. The geologist J. Harlan Brett spent decades in the early 20th century arguing that the channeled scablands had been created by a catastrophic flood and was treated as a crank by most of his colleagues, who found the idea of such a large and sudden event implausible on both scientific and somewhat philosophical grounds. Catastrophism as a geological concept had been out of fashion since the 19th century, replaced by the principle of gradualism, and a lot of geologists were emotionally invested in the idea that everything happened slowly. Bretz was eventually vindicated so thoroughly that he received the Penrose Medal, geology's highest honour, in 1979 at age 96, which is a deeply satisfying ending to what was a decades-long scientific argument. The lesson, as always, just because something seems too dramatic to be true does not mean it didn't happen. The freshwater pulses from these catastrophic lake drainages didn't just raise sea levels and carve landscapes. They also interfered with ocean circulation in ways that had global climate consequences. The Atlantic Ocean has a circulation system, often called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, that transports warm surface water from the tropics northward and returns cold deep water southward, acting as a massive heat redistribution system that keeps northwestern Europe several degrees warmer than it would otherwise be at its latitude. This circulation is driven partly by the sinking of cold, salty water in the North Atlantic. Add enormous quantities of cold, fresh water from a glacial lake drainage, and you dilute the salinity of the surface water, making it less dense, making it sink less efficiently, weakening the circulation. A weakened circulation means less heat transported northward, means cooling in the North Atlantic region, means potentially a sudden reversal of the warming trend over Europe and parts of North America. This is not a theoretical scenario. It happened. The Younger Dryas, a sudden cold period that began approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted about 1,200 years, is the most famous and best documented example. After nearly 2,000 years of gradual warming following the glacial maximum, temperatures in Greenland and the North Atlantic region dropped by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within decades. Decades. Not centuries, not millennia. Decades. The glaciers, which had been retreating, stopped, and in some areas re-advanced. Forests that had been expanding northward died back. The mammoth populations, already stressed by warming and hunting, faced another acute crisis. And then, about 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended almost as abruptly as it had begun. Greenland ice cores record a temperature increase of around 10 degrees Celsius in as little as a few decades, possibly less. The Ice Age was ending in lurches and reversals and sudden jerks rather than a smooth fade to warmth, and each of those lurches was a significant event for every living thing trying to adapt to the changing world. The sea level consequences of all this melting were, on the human timescale, the most immediately impactful. Between 20,000 years ago and roughly 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 to 130 meters. The rate wasn't constant. There were periods of acceleration like meltwater pulse 1a and periods of slower change, but the cumulative effect was the transformation of the world's coastlines beyond recognition. The North Sea, which today separates Britain from continental Europe, was dry land as recently as 8,000 years ago. The land surface now submerged beneath it, sometimes called Doggerland by archaeologists, was inhabited, crossed by rivers, home to forests and wetlands and presumably the people and animals that used them. In 2018 and subsequent years, fishermen dragging nets across the shallow North Sea floor have occasionally brought up mammoth bones, ancient tools, and fragments of worked wood, accidental archaeology from a drowned landscape. The North Sea isn't empty down there, it's a flooded country. The same story played out across what is now the Persian Gulf, largely dry during the glacial maximum, gradually flooding as sea levels rose, transforming inhabited river plains into ocean floor over a period of centuries. The flooding of the Black Sea, which may have occurred rapidly around 7,600 years ago, when rising Mediterranean water breached the Bosphorus sill and poured into what had been a freshwater lake at much lower elevation, has been proposed by some researchers as a direct ancestor of the flood myths preserved in Mesopotamian and biblical tradition. The evidence for whether this specific event was catastrophic enough and recent enough to have entered human oral tradition is debated, but the broader point is solid. The flooding of the post-glacial world was an event that humans experienced, survived, transmitted as memory, and eventually codified into story. The Great Flood is not a myth in the sense of being invented or symbolic. It is a myth in the proper sense, a story encoding a real experience, processed through cultural transmission over thousands of years, arriving at us in forms that have been shaped by every generation that passed it along. It is the oldest news story in human culture. The world drowned, people survived to tell about it, and they did tell about it for 10,000 years until someone finally wrote it down. What the flood left behind, both literally and figuratively, was a new world. Coastlines reset, land bridges gone, ecosystems reshuffled. Sea levels, where they largely remain today, give or take a few meters of variation. And scattered across the newly warmed, newly watered landscape, the remnant populations of humans who had survived everything the Ice Age had thrown at them, and were now, somewhat dazed, standing in a world that was warmer and wetter and, in some places, emptier of the great animals they had lived alongside for tens of thousands of years. Why those animals were gone is the question that the Ice Age in its final act poses most sharply to us, and it is a question we cannot answer without looking honestly at ourselves. Science has a handful of questions that look deceptively simple on the surface, but turn out, the moment you examine them carefully, to be among the most contested and consequential debates in the entire field. Why did the dinosaurs go extinct? What caused the Bronze Age collapse? And perhaps most personally uncomfortable of all, what killed the mammoths? Because unlike the dinosaurs, whose extinction arrived from outside the solar system on a rock 10 kilometers wide and required no human participation whatsoever, the end of the Ice Age megafauna happened while our direct ancestors were present, active and armed, which means that whatever the answer turns out to be, it involves us to some degree. And as a species, we have historically not been great at honest self-assessment on that particular topic. Let's lay out the evidence on both sides of the debate, because it is genuinely a debate, not a settled question with one faction of stubborn holdouts. And the data is complicated enough that any version of this story that presents a clean, simple answer is almost certainly oversimplifying. The climate change hypothesis is not invented by people trying to exonerate humanity. It has serious, substantial evidence behind it. The transition out of the last ice age was not just a warming. It was a fundamental restructuring of the ecosystems that had sustained Ice Age megafauna for hundreds of thousands of years. The Mammoth Steppe, that vast cold grassland we described in such detail earlier, the most productive terrestrial ecosystem in Earth's history, spanning from Spain to Alaska, did not survive the warming. As temperatures rose and the seasonal pattern of precipitation shifted, the cold, dry grassland ecology of the Mammoth Steppe gave way to different vegetation types. In the west and south, expanding forests replaced open grassland. In the far north, the grassland transitioned toward wetter, boggier tundra, a landscape that looks superficially similar but is significantly less productive for large grazers. Mosses and sedges replaced the rich mixture of grasses and herbs. The caloric density of the available vegetation dropped. The landscape that had supported megafaunal populations at densities that astonish modern ecologists was simply no longer there in the same form. This matters enormously because large herbivores are not infinitely adaptable. A woolly mammoth was not built to thrive in a boreal forest. Its biology, its digestive system, its behavioral patterns, everything about it was tuned for the open, productive grassland environment. Put it in an expanding birch forest and it's the wrong tool for the job, which is evolution's polite way of saying it's going to have a harder time finding enough food. Genetic studies of mammoth populations, analysing ancient DNA extracted from specimens spanning tens of thousands of years, show that mammoth genetic diversity, the breadth of variation within populations that acts as a buffer against disease, environmental stress and demographic decline, was already shrinking before humans became a significant presence in Siberia and the far north. The populations were contracting. The genetic signal of stress was present. Something was already going wrong before the hunters arrived. Additionally, the extinction of Ice Age megafauna was not limited to species that humans definitely hunted. Woolly rhinos, cave lions, cave bears, cave hyenas, the Irish elk. Most of these disappeared in the same general window of time as the mammoths, and not all of them were primary targets of human hunters. It's difficult to construct a hunting hypothesis that accounts for the simultaneous disappearance of predators alongside their prey, since hunters generally don't systematically hunt apex predators that they're not in direct conflict with. Climate and habitat disruption, on the other hand, affected everything simultaneously regardless of where it sat in the food web. If the ecosystem collapses, predators collapse with it because their prey populations have collapsed. The whole pyramid falls, not just the bottom. That's the case for climate as the primary driver. Now here is the case against it being the whole story, which is where things get genuinely uncomfortable. Ice Age transitions are not new. The Pleistocene, the geological epoch covering roughly the last 2.6 million years, which corresponds closely to what we've been calling the Ice Age in this video, included multiple glacial cycles before the most recent one. There were glacial maxima roughly 140,000 years ago, 250,000 years ago, 340,000 years ago, and at intervals before that going back through the epoch. Each of these glacial periods was followed by an interglacial warming, a transition comparable in scale and speed to the one that ended the last ice age. The mammoth steppe contracted, and the ecosystem shifted during each of those transitions too. And yet, and this is the critical point, the megafauna survived all of them. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, giant deer, their fossil records span multiple glacial-interglacial cycles. They had been through this before. They had in fact been through it many times before. Climate change alone had not finished them during any previous interglacial. Why was this one different? The answer, when you map the timing of megafaunal extinctions against the arrival of modern humans on each continent, is not subtle. In Africa, where modern humans evolved and where megafauna had hundreds of thousands of years to coexist with and adapt to increasingly sophisticated human hunters, the large animal extinctions are relatively modest compared to other continents. African megafauna is dramatically depleted from its Ice Age peak, but substantial numbers of large species survived into the modern era. In Eurasia, where Neanderthals and earlier human relatives had been present for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived, the extinction rate was higher, but still not total devastation. In Australia, where modern humans arrived roughly 50,000 years ago into a continent whose megafauna had never encountered any hominin predator of any kind, and had therefore developed precisely zero behavioural defences against human hunting pressure. The extinctions were rapid and nearly complete. The giant marsupials, the massive wombat relatives, the enormous flightless birds, gone, overwhelmingly within a relatively short period following human arrival. In the Americas, where modern humans arrived approximately 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, again into a continent whose animals had never seen a human being, the extinctions were catastrophic. 3/4 of all large mammal genera in North and South America disappeared within a few thousand years of human arrival, including, it should be noted, every single native horse species in the Americas, which went extinct in the same window. The horses that Columbus and subsequent European colonizers brought to the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries were not returning to a horse-free continent. They were returning to a continent that had horses thousands of years earlier, lost them all, almost certainly significantly due to human hunting, and then had a 12,000-year gap in large equid presence before Europeans reintroduced them. This pattern, intact megafauna before humans, rapid extinctions after, repeated itself on every major landmass and large island that modern humans colonized for the first time. New Zealand, which was not reached by humans until roughly 700 years ago, had giant moa birds standing up to 3.6 meters tall and weighing up to 230 kilograms. Within a few centuries of Polynesian settlement, all 9 moa species were extinct. Madagascar, reached by humans roughly 2,000 years ago, had giant lemurs the size of gorillas, enormous tortoises, pygmy hippos, and the elephant bird, the largest bird that ever lived, standing 3 meters tall and laying eggs with a volume of over 160 chicken eggs. Gone in the centuries following human arrival. The pattern is consistent enough across enough independent cases that dismissing human hunting as a significant factor requires a willful suspension of pattern recognition. So where does this leave us? The current scientific consensus, or what passes for consensus in a field where people publish papers with titles specifically designed to argue with other people's papers, is a version of the synergy hypothesis. Climate change degraded and fragmented the mammoth steppe, reducing the range and productivity of the ecosystem that sustained megafaunal populations. This ecological stress reduced population sizes, reduced genetic diversity, reduced the reproductive resilience of animal groups that had previously been able to absorb losses and recover. And into these stressed, reduced, fragmented populations came human hunters, skilled, coordinated, adaptable in ways that no previous predator had been, applying a level of hunting pressure that healthy, abundant populations might have sustained. But that already stressed populations could not. The mammoth didn't go extinct because climate change killed every single one of them. It went extinct because climate change knocked them down, and human hunting finished the job. This is not a vindication of the climate-only hypothesis. It is not a clean exoneration of human responsibility. It is unfortunately the closest thing to the truth that current evidence supports. A crime with 2 contributing factors, one of which was a planetary-scale geophysical process operating over millennia, and the other of which was us. The most recent genetic research adds a further wrinkle that is simultaneously scientifically fascinating and somewhat grim. Analysis of mammoth DNA from specimens spanning the final period of their existence, from about 10,000 years ago right through to the extinction of the last dwarf mammoth population on Wrangel Island off the Siberian coast, which survived until approximately 4,000 years ago, outlasting the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, which is an astonishing and somewhat poignant fact, shows that as populations shrank and became isolated, inbreeding increased deleterious genetic mutations accumulated and the animal's biological fitness declined in ways that would have affected their immune function, reproductive success, and sensory systems. The last Wrangel Island mammoths were, in genetic terms, already a population in serious trouble independent of any direct human pressure. They had lost much of the genetic diversity that had made their ancestors successful, and they showed genomic signatures of what biologists call an extinction vortex, a self-reinforcing spiral of small population size, inbreeding, reduced fitness, and further population decline that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. They were, by the end, running on empty, a remnant of a remnant on an Arctic island, carrying the last copies of a genetic heritage that had once stretched across a continent. The last mammoth died, by the best current estimates, sometime around 2000 BCE. The Egyptians were building temples to their gods. The Bronze Age was well underway. Somewhere in the Siberian Arctic, the last individual of the most successful large mammal ecosystem in Earth's history was gone, and the world that replaced the one it came from was already ancient history to the civilizations building monuments. Along the Nile? What we lost when the mammoths and the megafauna went is not just a collection of impressive animals in a museum catalogue. We lost an entire functional ecosystem, the mammoth steppe, that had no parallel and has had no successor. We lost the engineers of the most productive cold-climate biological system the planet had ever produced. We are living in the impoverished aftermath of that loss, and most of us don't know it, because the world we were born into looks normal to us. It isn't, particularly. But it's what we have, and what we do with it is still, for now, an open question. Here is a fact that should stop you cold, pun fully intended and completely unapologetic. Right now, as you watch this video, somewhere in Siberia, a researcher in a field camp is extracting a core of frozen ground that has been continuously frozen for 30,000, 50,000, or in some cases over 1 million years. Inside that core is air, actual atmospheric air sealed in tiny bubbles, from a time before anatomically modern humans existed in significant numbers, before any human civilization, before agriculture, before writing, before anything we would recognize as human history. They are opening a time capsule that seals itself automatically, requires no maintenance, and has been sitting in the permafrost waiting to be read for longer than our species has been doing anything particularly interesting. The Ice Age is not gone. It is stored, and we are currently in the process of defrosting it, which is going extremely well as long as your definition of going well is extremely flexible. The permafrost, the permanently frozen ground layer that underlies roughly a quarter of the Northern Hemisphere's land surface, covering enormous swaths of Siberia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, is one of the most important and least discussed systems on the planet. It formed during the Ice Age and has persisted through the relatively warm interglacial we've been enjoying for the past 11,700 years, because the climate in the high Arctic has remained cold enough to keep it frozen. The top layer, called the active layer, thaws and refreezes each summer and winter. But below a certain depth, varying from a metre or two in warmer permafrost regions to hundreds of metres in the coldest areas of Siberia, the ground has not thawed since it first froze, in some cases during the height of the last glacial maximum, or earlier. What's in the permafrost is extraordinary. Ice Age animals, obviously. We've discussed the mammoths, and they're genuinely the most famous inhabitants of the permafrost freezer. But the list extends considerably further. Woolly rhino carcasses, cave lion cubs so well preserved that their fur is still intact and their faces still identifiable, baby horses and bison with their internal organs in place, a cave bear cub recovered in 2020 from the Siberian permafrost, with its nose, teeth and soft tissue so intact that researchers initially described it as looking like it was simply asleep, which is simultaneously the most poetic and most unsettling description of an archaeological specimen imaginable. These animals are not fossils in the conventional sense. They are not mineralized, not replaced by stone. They are the original biological material preserved by continuous freezing for tens of thousands of years. Scientists have extracted cells from some of these specimens and identified structures that retain biological activity. The line between ancient preserved remains and frozen organism is, in some cases, uncomfortably thin. The ice cores are the permafrost's other great gift to science. Drilled from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, which are in essence compressed records of tens of thousands of years of snowfall stacked in continuous layers, ice cores provide the most detailed and accurate record of past atmospheric composition available anywhere on Earth. Each layer of ice contains air bubbles from the year it formed, dust particles from wherever the wind was blowing, chemical signatures from volcanic eruptions, and isotopic ratios that encode the temperature at which the snow fell. Reading an ice core is literally reading the atmosphere of the past, year by year, going back hundreds of thousands of years. The Vostok core from Antarctica extends 400,000 years into the past. The Epica Dome Sea core goes back 800,000 years. A project currently underway aims to recover ice going back 1.5 million years. We're reading the climate diary of the planet from before our species existed, and the data it contains is extraordinarily detailed. What those cores tell us about the relationship between atmospheric CO2 and temperature over the past 800,000 years is, if you're paying attention to current events, not exactly comforting reading. The CO2 levels recorded in ice cores cycled between roughly 180 parts per million during glacial maxima and about 280 parts per million during interglacials, a range that corresponds directly to the temperature swings between full ice age and the warm periods in between. The current atmospheric CO2 concentration is approximately 420 parts per million. That number does not appear anywhere in the 800,000-year ice core record. It is higher than anything the planet has seen in at least that long, and we are adding to it at a rate that has no geological parallel in the ice core data. The ice cores are not projecting future doom. They are simply recording what has happened and what is happening without any agenda. The agenda is entirely in how we interpret what they're telling us. And what the permafrost itself is doing in response to warming temperatures is one of the more alarming feedback loops currently active in the climate system. Permafrost contains enormous quantities of organic carbon, the preserved remains of plants, animals, and microbial communities that accumulated and froze over tens of thousands of years of ice age conditions. Estimates suggest that Arctic permafrost contains somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7 trillion tons of carbon, which is roughly twice the amount currently in the entire atmosphere. As long as it stays frozen, that carbon stays locked up. When it thaws, microbial activity resumes, organic material begins to decompose, and that decomposition releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Methane is a significantly more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 in the short term. Over a 20-year window, it traps about 80 times more heat per unit weight. A large-scale release of permafrost methane would add warming on top of existing warming, which would thaw more permafrost, which would release more methane. This is the feedback loop that climate scientists refer to with various degrees of alarm depending on their personality type, and comfort with publicly expressing alarm. The permafrost is already thawing. This is not a prediction or a projection. It is a measurement. Permafrost temperatures across Siberia, Alaska, and Canada have risen significantly over the past several decades. The active layer, the surface zone that thaws each summer, is deepening. Infrastructure built on permafrost, from buildings to pipelines to roads, is destabilizing as the ground beneath it loses its frozen rigidity. In parts of Siberia, the thawing creates distinctive crater-like depressions and sinkholes called thermokarst, where the ground simply collapses as ice within it melts. In some areas, enormous gas explosion craters, the Siberian phenomenon of sudden methane eruptions through the softening ground, which created dramatic and completely inexplicable-looking holes in the tundra when they were first photographed around. 2014 are direct evidence of pressurized methane gas escaping from thawing permafrost in acute rather than gradual events. The permafrost is not slowly exhaling. In places it is burping methane through the tundra with enough force to throw chunks of frozen soil across the landscape. This is not ideal. There is also a biological dimension to permafrost thaw that generates headlines periodically and deserves serious rather than sensationalist treatment. The permafrost contains ancient microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, and other biological material that have been frozen since the Ice Age and are in some cases still viable. Researchers have successfully revived bacteria from permafrost samples dating back hundreds of thousands of years. In 2022, microscopic animals called deloid rotifers were revived from 24,000-year-old Siberian permafrost, functional, living, reproducing organisms that had been frozen since before the height of the last glacial maximum. Ancient plant material has been germinated from permafrost seeds. And ancient viruses, the kind that infect single-celled organisms rather than humans, which is the important clarification that tends to get dropped when this story gets reported in certain media outlets, have been isolated from permafrost samples and found to retain infectious capability. The 2014 discovery and reactivation of a 30,000-year-old giant virus from Siberian permafrost generated enormous press coverage, almost all of which was approximately 80% more alarming than the actual science warranted, since the virus in the question infects amoebas and poses no threat to humans. The genuine concern is more nuanced. Permafrost may contain ancient pathogens, including some that infected animals or humans in the distant past and against which modern immune systems have no defense, that are released as the ground thaws. This has already happened in a small, specific case. A 2016 anthrax outbreak in Siberia that killed a child and hospitalized dozens more was traced to a thawing reindeer carcass from an animal that had died in an anthrax outbreak roughly 75 years earlier, released from the permafrost by an unusually warm summer. The permafrost, in other words, is not just a time capsule of interesting scientific specimens, it is a biological archive that was never meant to be opened at room temperature. All of this brings us to the question that the Ice Age, viewed across its full arc from the first cooling 2.6 million years ago to the present, poses most directly. We have spent this entire video watching a planet balance on the edge of stability, warming and cooling in cycles driven by orbital mechanics, volcanic activity, ocean circulation, and the behavior of living things, including eventually us. We have watched ecosystems assemble over millions of years into systems of extraordinary productivity, and then collapse in geologically instantaneous events when the conditions that sustained them changed. We have watched a species, our species, develop enough intelligence to survive the most hostile climate conditions on Earth, build shelters from the bones of the largest animals alive, and paint masterpieces on cave walls by lamplight, and then use that same intelligence and coordination to hunt the animals whose bones made their shelters to extinction, permanently dismantling the ecosystem that had been their home and ours for 50,000 years. The Ice Age is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant to the present. The permafrost preserving it is literally thawing under our feet, releasing carbon that has been frozen since before our species was recognizable, in quantities that will affect the climate system our children and their children will inherit. The lesson the Ice Age offers is not reassuring. It is not the story of a planet that bent to pressure and recovered. It is the story of a balance so old and so complex that when it finally broke, it broke completely, and the world on the other side was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. We are currently conducting an experiment to see how much pressure a planetary balance can take before it breaks again. The Ice Age, if it could speak, would probably suggest we already know the answer to that question. We just don't like it. If you've made it this far, thank you genuinely. This was a long one and you stayed for all of it. If this video sparked something for you, drop a comment below. Which part hit hardest? The mammoths? The flood myths? The permafrost time bomb we're currently defrosting? I read every comment. Hit the like button if you want the algorithm to know this kind of deep dive is worth making, and subscribe if you want more. There's a lot more where this came from.